very welcome to this webinar, which is a follow-on from an earlier webinar that we had. And this is about addressing questions that arose from that webinar. So thanks everyone who contributed the questions to Silvia and colleagues, and that's formed the basis of this webinar. I'm Mary Chambers. I'm the Director of the Centre for Public Engagement, and the Centre is hosting this event in collaboration with the Centre for Engagement and Dissemination, NIHR, and also the NIHR Applied Research Collaborative, South London, the PPI research theme. So the colleagues that are joining us today from the Centre for Engagement and Dissemination is Silvia and Jeremy and Reshma from Health and Social Care Research Wales. We have Jim Elliott from the HRA, Sevi and Stan from the Applied Research Collaborative, and Duncan, my colleague, from the Centre for Public Engagement, Kingston and St George's. So I am the chair for the event. I shall do my best to manage it and keep on time. If we move on now, I would like to introduce Jeremy, who will give a little background to this particular session. And then other colleagues will join and address the questions that have been raised.
Thank you very much, Mary, and welcome everybody to this. As Mary said, this is a follow-on event from one that happened a few weeks ago on the subject of payments. Nearly 400 people attended, which tells you something about the importance of the subject and the unresolved issues around it. And this was a planned event continuing questions and inquiries that were prompted by the first session. And so in the lead is going to be Silvia from my centre, the Centre for Engagement Dissemination, which is the new centre that took over from the old Involve Centre at NIHR. And she's our expert on payments and was responsible for updating our recent guidance. And other colleagues are going to join for the different themes that we're tackling. Essentially three themes that reflect where the energy lay in much of the questioning in the first session and subsequent questions that have been put down by people. One is around how universities go about dealing with payment systems, combination of the way they're organised and something around the culture in which universities work. Second is the vexed issue of the tax and employment status of public contributors and how that is viewed, how public contribution to research is viewed by the HMRC, and where there is work afoot to try and amend the existing guidance and approach. And the third theme is around the equally contentious issue of payment rates. So we have some questions from the previous session that we're going to be working through. But as Mary said, we also invite people to put questions or comments in the chat as we go along. We'll do our best within the limits of the time to address as many as possible. That's plenty from me. I'll be doing a little bit of kind of sifting of questions as we go along, but otherwise I'm now going to hand over to Silvia.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this follow-up event on the payments guidance that we spoke about a month ago. So on 21st of April, we had a really successful event that, however, as Jeremy said, provided the opportunity for you all to send in lots of questions. And so today will be quite a different format from before. You probably see kind of the different setup in the meeting already. So it will be less of me just talking at you. And I've got other colleagues who will be contributing to the various themes that we discussed today as well. But as Jeremy said as well, do use the chat, and if I'm suspecting there will be lots of discussion coming from today, but we do have an hour, so do get in touch after the event as well if there's any follow-up questions from this event as well. So as Jeremy said, we went through the questions from the Q&A that was saved after the event on the 21st of April. And there were lots of questions, around kind of 150 that I sifted through. But the main three that really stood out were the structural issues within organisations, especially universities, that are putting barriers in the way of effective payment systems. The second one is tax and employment. And I think there's quite a lot of overlap between these two themes. So in how I will propose to answer those questions, there might be some overlap. And then, yes, there's payment rates that came up as a topic as well. So we'll try to get as much covered during the meeting today. But I am aware there are also other topics that came up. So I do want to, as I said at the meeting in April, want to remind you that this is an open conversation on the topic of payments. I'm also a reminder that the guidance that we published, I still see it very much as a constant work in progress. So do get in touch about how it can be improved if there's anything that's missing. I'm still kind of sifting through all the feedback that I received on the guidance specifically as well. Also, just a last point of just housekeeping on the actual themes that we're going to cover today before I delve into the first theme is that there were a few questions that came through on welfare benefits, but I would like to address those separately and kind of not as part of this conversation unless there's they come in as part of the other themes, because I don't see myself as an expert on welfare benefits because the topic is so broad and so complex. So in the first instance, I would refer to the payments guidance on the topic of welfare benefits. So now I'm just going to briefly summarise the main questions that came through on the first theme that Jeremy and I introduced, which was around how there are real kind of structural issues at organisational level, putting barriers in the way of effective payment systems. So a few of the questions asked what the role of the NIHR guidance is within these systems, which a lot of colleagues are saying don't really work to set up effective payment processes, both kind of within kind of universities, but also in kind of understanding what the government guidance, so for example, HMRC and DWP guidance says. There's some challenges in implementing the guidance within these systems that are often inflexible. There were also comments around how the guidance can be interpreted differently within different contexts and systems, and how this can lead to inconsistent approaches to payment. There were a few comments on how NIHR needs to use its position to lobby for changes within university infrastructure to solve system problems. And there were also comments on how NIHR could be more directive to organisations in ensuring that the guidance is implemented. And then there was a last point which came through a bit from the Q&A from the event, but also on Twitter engagement that I kind of was following up on afterwards, which was this sense that public involvement leads and researchers want to implement the guidance, but sometimes might feel disempowered to implement the guidance if the system isn't responsive. So those were the main questions that came through from the Q&A from the last event. So first of all, I wanted to acknowledge that these challenges aren't new, but we do see them and understand them within NIHR. As Jeremy said, we know that payment is kind of a continued problem, hence why there's 125 of you here today, but also there were almost 400 people at the last event. So there are these ongoing issues, and we do recognise them. The NIHR guidance that I kind of spoke through last time, in its kind of current form, we didn't specifically set out to address these issues head on. We wanted to provide a useful guidance document that would help us transition from kind of the involved guidance that we had into guidance that was fit for purpose and that would be ready to go out as soon as possible, really. But as I said, I do want to see this as an ongoing piece of work. So I will be supplementing the guidance with much more information as we go on and understand more about how to overcome some of the problems in the system. We are also aware that the guidance can be tricky to implement and then there are inconsistencies. and we see them within NIHR as well, and that's something that we are thinking about and addressing. So in thinking about how to overcome these big structural issues, as I said, I think there's more that we could do to improve the guidance, but actually the main way that us at NIHR are addressing these underlying structural issues is by lobbying for change in partnership with other organisations, because these questions and issues aren't just kind of unique to NIHR funded research. So what I've been doing is working with other organisations, as I mentioned, and I kind of preempted this work at the end of the previous meeting, but we'll talk much more about this work. So we've teamed up with other funders and government departments from the UK 4 nations and the Republic of Ireland, and this was a pre-existing group which actually developed the UK standards for public involvement. So it includes representatives from in public involvement representatives from NIHR, Health Research Authority, Health and Social Care Northern Ireland, Health and Care Research Wales, a Chief Scientist Office in Scotland, and the Health Research Board Ireland. And we want to use our kind of the leadership positions and influence routes that these organisations have to push for change on this topic. Our main goal and aim and vision for this work is to give confidence to researchers, public contributors and public involvement leads, and also finance and HR professionals. And our intention is that the output of this project will support organisations in utilising their public involvement budget appropriately, and also importantly to develop effective and simple payment policies with clear understanding of any employment, tax or benefit implications to offering payment. So what will this look like? Actually, our thoughts about what we want to do have changed over the past couple of months, also in response to the feedback that I got from the last event. So our original thought was to develop a guidance document to help people navigate through this issue, but actually we want to go beyond just creating another guidance document to really maximise the impact of what this group can achieve. And so we are thinking about, for example, engaging with HMRC to see what changes can be made to guidance. And shortly I'm going to introduce two colleagues that I'm working very actively with on this, who can talk to you a bit more about specific plans. But I also wanted to mention that we want to work collaboratively with this. So that whilst this project started off with us kind of representing the funders and government organisations, we do want to build and diversify we're calling it an interest group, which we want to include public involvement professionals, researchers, public contributors, but also colleagues from finance and HR, and also, for example, charities. So we're building a group of people that can really influence us in helping achieve our goals. So as I said, I'm working with two colleagues that are joining me here today, Reshma Rakoba from Health and Care Research Wales and Jim Elliott from the Health Research Authority. We've been kind of actively leading this work. So as I said, I didn't want to just talk at you for the whole time, so I'm going to pass over to my colleagues. Reshma is going to talk a bit more about kind of our project plan and how we are aiming to achieve this work. And I think Jim was going to talk a bit more about our kind of engagement piece and liaising with HMRC. Over to you, Reshma.
Thank you, Sylvia. Hi, everyone. So I'm Reshma Rakoba, Head of Public Involvement, Research Governance and Digital at Health and Care Research Wales. And I think Sylvia gave a very good overview as to where the project work has gotten up to date. So as she mentioned, given the feedback that she received on the last session that was held in April, and other conversations that we've heard through various groups, we've modified our project plan very recently to take into account what else we can do to maximise the impact and affect real and meaningful change that helps you as professionals to implement easy processes for payment where people are taking that up. So in terms of what I'll do is I'll give you sort of an overall picture of the aims and objectives of our project, and then I'll hand over to Jim to take some of the other bits around what we're doing around engaging with various groups, as Silvia said. So the intention is that the project outputs will support organisations, as Silvia said, in putting in place really clear processes that also give them the confidence that they are in line with all regulations around tax and employment, not risking any fines, etc., which we know is an issue at the moment. What we'd really like to do is influence key stakeholders, so raising awareness of this issue on everyone's behalf, kind of collating all the views and the strength of feeling, and trying to influence our partners in committing to delivering a solution in partnership. As Silvia said, we'll be doing this through various means, by conversations at key leadership levels, and also working to co-create a sort of practical guidance document that will help everyone, including HR and finance professionals, to put in place clear processes. So in order to do that, we'll obviously be talking to everyone about what exactly the issues are that they're facing, what the biggest challenges are, and work together to find solutions to that. To that end, we'll also be seeking anyone out there that you might know who have already implemented some sustainable solutions and some practical steps to make payments easier. So we're looking for best practice to share and specific issues that people are facing to try and overcome. As Silvia said, we're hoping to work with HMRC, ask them about making more clear updates where possible around payment for public involvement in research. Because we know there are issues experienced, particularly linked to two guidance documents, EIM 71105, if that means anything to anyone out there, and IR 35 as well. And we've discovered that there are updates made quite regularly to this, so hopefully this is achievable, but we have yet to have that conversation with them. However, when we take this work to them, we'll have the evidence and the anecdotal stories that you will be telling us as well, to demonstrate how important these updates are. So we hope to sort of lobby them in that way. We'll also be developing some public-facing guidance with public contributors to lay out what to expect when taking up the offer of payment for their time. And hopefully these steps will really help us to overcome some of the issues. Now, I understand that there are going to be questions around, how soon are you going to do this? Because the issue is very live and very current, and we understand that. So the timelines around this project are reflective of that. We have a number of steps to do, which is to finalise the project plan, understand the kind of governance structure that we're going to follow, because obviously this needs support from policy colleagues and organisations that are going to back us when we go to HMRC and release this guidance across the nations. So at the moment, we're working within the realms of the 5 Nations Working Group, which is an extension of the group that worked on the UK public standards for involvement in research, which you'll all be aware of. So we're having the discussions within that group to take forward that work, bringing in mapping of key stakeholders, and then understanding who within the group or which subgroups are going to approach different stakeholders and how. I've seen a question in the chat about Universities UK, and we'll be working with them. They're mapped as one of our key stakeholders, and they are on the radar, so to speak, to lobby with them as well. So I'll hand over now to Jim to talk about the interest groups and the stakeholder groups we're working with.
Thank you, Reshma, and good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Elliott. I'm the Public Involvement Lead from the Health Research Authority. Just picking up on the explanations that Reshma and Silvia given of the work that we're trying to do, and lots of comments in the chat already. I think it's important to just say a few things, and one is that the particular issues, the specific focus that we're looking at is very much the employment and tax liability issues, employment status, tax liability. And that covers any organisation, every single sector. So it's not just a public sector thing, it's universities, it's charities, and it's the commercial sector as well. So anybody anywhere in the UK who pays people and communities to get involved in research and actually in services as well will encounter these issues. And they're coming up everywhere, and they're not new. Some work was done with HMRC by a group of public bodies that are part of the Department of Health, the so-called arm's length bodies, 3 years ago now. A small slight fix was made and it helped for a little while, but actually HMRC has been ramping up its rules and regulations and its scrutiny of how people who are not on the payroll are paid, and that's where somebody referred to IR35 and somebody said, what is that? That's legislation which determines the state of the employment status of people who are not employees but are doing work for an organisation. So lots of contractors, lots of people set themselves up as companies and do work for organisations in all sorts of sectors, and they're covered by this IR35, what's called the intermediaries legislation, and that's not well understood in many places, and there are a lot of uncertainties about whether it applies to public contributors, and for the most part it doesn't, but there's a lot that needs to be sorted out around that. And the guidance that Reshma mentioned, which is part of the Employment Income Manual on the HMRC website, and there's a section called EIM, which is Employment Income Manual. 71105 is a page around research volunteers, lay participants and participants in clinical trials. That covers some of it, but it's very uncertain, and one of the questions last time was said that guidance is very unclear. So with that in mind, because it affects everybody, but it's come up through a route that's led to Silvia and Reshma and myself then working with a number of other people, we know this needs to include a really wide range of stakeholders. The really important reason for that is there's a common problem everywhere, so it makes sense for us to work together collaboratively, and there's strength in numbers. The number of public contributors out there working, involved in health and social care research, we think is somewhere in the region of at least 20,000 across the UK, and that's based on knowing that the work that the Health Research Authority and NIHR and others did to support COVID research last year had a network of networks, and there were 8,000 people in that, and that wasn't everybody. So our kind of estimate is there's at least 20,000 people, so it's a big issue. It affects all sectors, and when an approach is made to talk to HMRC to try to change the guidance that's on their website, it really needs to come from one place, but backed up by a huge amount of information from all sectors. So we're aware of lots of initiatives in different parts of the country that keep popping up, and it's really important that through everybody involved, and all of you on the call can help in providing intelligence for the working group that we have, so that we can kind of pull all that together as best we can and make a single approach to HMRC that's got a huge amount of weight behind it. So at the moment we're just working our way through a whole range of different organisations that we want to get in touch with, make them aware of what we're doing, and that's from people who that's all range of health and social care research organisations, and it's really important that those that are have uncertainties and are concerned about HMRC rules are aware of what's going on, so that hopefully they can hold fire in terms of changing the situation, because a number of public contributors, quite a lot of public contributors, are being told they may have to be put on the payroll to be paid, and that's a big disincentive for many people, and we need to try to do what we can to stop any changes happening until this whole issue has been worked through. We're aware of the urgency, as Reshma said. It will take some time, and we'll work as quickly as we can, but we'll need to have some sort of fixes, as it were, some workarounds to stop finance departments in all sorts of organisations changing their policies until we've got this all finally sorted out. And hopefully we can do that this year, but the working with HMRC will take quite some time potentially. It's a very large organisation, and this is quite a tiny issue in the massive range of things that they have to do. So we're going to have to work very carefully to see how we can raise awareness with them. There was a question in the chat about what about MPs? Very good question. We're working to link this work into the work around recovery, resilience and growth, so the new clinical research strategy, which has full ministerial backing. So that should help raise the profile if we need to get the attention of HMRC if we have difficulties getting what we need to get sorted out through the routes that we're going to go through. So I think I've probably said enough for now. I'll hand back to you, Silvia.
Thank you, Jim and Reshma, for that. Really kind of brought to life the work that we're doing. I think another element of this work, which hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think is going to be hopefully really useful, and it actually touches on one of the questions that we got on the topic of tax and employment status, which I'll read out because it kind of feeds into what we're trying to achieve also with this work, which is, so the question was that there's need for engagement with HMRC to agree what types of public contributor roles fit within the HMRC definition of volunteer worker, self-employed, etc. So we are going to include some information in the guidance, or whatever it will look like in the output of this work, which will be a quite simple, but essentially we're looking at developing a categorization essentially of typical public contributor roles, keeping it very simple because we're aware that there's so many different types of roles and activities that members of the public can have in research. But I think there's a real appetite for very simple categories of what those types of roles are and likely tax implications, and potentially also looking at payment methods as well. Hopefully that would give more information and more confidence for people to understand what types of public contributor roles have what tax implications. We're still working through that, but hopefully that's just an extra piece of advice and guidance that will help people make decisions. And also I was reading in the chat about as well, feeling that people need to know what they're signing up for as public contributors, and hopefully that will give public contributors some more detail as well of what activities might have what tax implications, etc. That's just another piece of work that we're trying to include in this project. So now I guess we wanted to open up for other questions. I've been kind of scanning through the questions very quickly, but I wondered whether Mary or Jeremy or Savi had any particular follow-up or anything you wanted to bring up.
Sylvia, there's a few things that I've noticed in the chat. There was a question about right to work checks. Not quite sure, it doesn't really fit into any of our themes, but obviously it's an issue that has been raised. Is there anything we can say about that?
I think it would depend. I think I've heard of right to work checks needing, so public contributors asked to provide documents for right to work checks when they're being paid through payroll. Obviously there are big concerns about asking individuals to provide those types of documents. Some people might not have a passport, so it might be that's a barrier to getting involved. I think that's what we're trying to do as well in engaging with colleagues with human resources, understanding where those checks are needed. On the whole, they shouldn't be, but when there's an understanding that a public contributor might be an employee, like I was asked right to work checks when I joined NIHR as an employee, that's where those requests come from. But that is something that would require more kind of case-by-case understanding, and but that is something that I'm aware we could include more information on in our guidance as well.
Alice Williams has pointed out that there are mixed views on whether it's a good or bad thing to be on the payroll as a public contributor. There isn't a consensus about that, and I think we need to be alive to the fact that different people have different views. Also note that Mark Keller has said that in NHS England they use 4 categories to define the different roles, and that sounds really interesting, and if there's a simpler way of doing that, we should probably try and borrow from what NHS England are doing. So thank you for that, Mark Keller. I'm just doing a little bit more scanning of the questions. There's a lot there. As ever, I think we'll have to take a lot of this away for after the meeting. So Jacqueline has asked a question about basic guidelines around what is volunteering, service user involvement, co-production. Yes, it addresses the same point about defining the roles. And yes, we are trying to clarify that. I think that would be very helpful.
Can I just chip in, Jeremy, on the point you raised?
Jim, yes.
Alice saying about the 4 categories of work. Part of the work that we're doing is to try to draw up some different categorizations or pen portraits of different generic roles in public involvement. So from the kind of one-off consultation right through as it builds up through collaboration into co-production, and then use HMRC's check employment status online tool, which is something which allows you for anything you're doing to check whether it's considered to be an employment role or a self-employed role for tax purposes. We're going to try and apply that tool to each of these pen portraits to give an illustration as part of the guidance, which says, well, if the role that you're taking part in, you're a public contributor or you're involving people with, fits one of these categories, then this is the answer we got from that assessment as a way of helping whilst we're sorting out the sort of hopefully the more long-lasting solution through the HMRC employment manual.
A flurry of questions has now come through. So I think we are going to have to do some of this offline, I think. Please, people do take up the offer of emailing Silvia. You might at the end of the session want to resend your email address, Silvia, otherwise it'll be lost in the thread. Let's move on now to the third theme around payments. There's already been quite a lot of questions around which I think will be addressed around rates of payment. So back to you, Silvia.
Yeah, so actually there weren't that many outstanding questions in terms of tax. I think a lot of the work that we're doing with the Five Nations group, especially Jim and Reshma and I, will address a lot of those questions that came through on the tax implications of paying for public involvement. But also just on that, I wanted to mention that I mentioned at the previous meeting, I'm still compiling a document with case studies of both examples of good practice mainly, but also kind of key challenges on this topic. So that's still in the pipeline and is coming soon. So yeah, so the topic of payment rates actually came up quite a lot in the chat and actually also subsequently at other meetings that I had with colleagues. Specifically, I think they can be summarized in three main questions around it, which is, firstly, why haven't the payment rates changed in many years? There was a question around inconsistency of payment rates, and also that's an interesting point actually about whether payment rates should go up as public contributors gain experience. So I have a few thoughts and reflections on these questions myself, but I'd also be interested to hear from kind of colleagues on this as well, and hopefully in the activity in the chat. So we at NIHR haven't reviewed payment rates in a while. Obviously they were set by Involve at the time, but internally we are considering benchmarking our own payment rates within NIHR, and I very much see this work as potentially informing future work that we do to update our payment rates that are in the guidance. And as I said in the presentation at the last event and is explained in the guidance, the payment rates that we do provide in the guidance are their guidance. And however, because of that, that leads to inconsistencies in payment rates. And that was something that came through quite strongly from a meeting that I went to kind of between these two meetings about whether NIHR should be more directive around what payment rates should be. And there was also a suggestion that came through about whether we could have kind of lower and upper thresholds to payment rates. I think it's an interesting consideration, and I know that NIHR is the largest funder of health research in the country, but we still exist within a wider context. So whilst I think that we need to review our payment rates, I think there's still more internal discussions that we need to have about how directive we should be about setting the payment rates more explicitly. And I think it's a very interesting point as well about increasing payment rates as public contributors gain experience. And I had a reflection about, well, I think there's a tricky balance to be found, and this applies not only for increasing public contributor payments as someone gains more experience, but also when thinking about increasing payment rates in general. Obviously, it's a good thing. It's showing that we're moving ahead with the times and we are kind of reviewing the way that we recognise and reward public contributors. But we also need to be mindful that there could be some unintended negative consequences. So, for example, if some public contributors on benefits, as you'll have heard and read in the guidance, there's limits to how much an individual on benefits can claim. And so whilst, yes, we do say that someone has the right to ask for less payment, this might not be known until someone's already kind of starting to get involved. So if there's a public involvement opportunity advertised online, for example, we have people in research where people upload their involvement opportunities and someone sees that there's quite a high amount offered as payment, that might inadvertently put them off and they might not know that they are allowed to ask for less. And also if there are payment rates which are kind of constantly increasing, we also need to be mindful of how those would be viewed by finance and whether they might be queried. So whilst on the whole, I think a review and potential increase of the payment rates is a good thing to consider, we also need to be mindful of kind of these other consequences as well. So those are my thoughts and reflections. See lots of questions have come through the chat whilst I was speaking, but I would wonder whether either my colleague Jeremy has a thought of that, or Jim, Reshma, Savi about kind of thoughts within your organisations on payment rates. Open to the attendees as well. Just going to scroll through the chat in the meantime.
I'll just clarify for the benefit of the audience that in Wales we very much work in alignment with NIHR and other partners. So, you know, any updates to the payment rates would be reflected in our work as well. So we would look to do the same.
Thanks, Reshma. That's what happens in our organisations too.
And also at the Health Research Authority, we're conscious of this, and having used the involve rate, are going to review the payment rates ourselves as well, because it seems sensible to do that. And as many have reflected, it's been the same rate for a very long time. But there is a kind of issue around there's a delicate balance. It's not you're not paying somebody in the same way you pay a plumber to do a piece of work. It's a reward and recognition payment, sometimes referred to as a bursary or an honorarium, and it should go up with time. But equally, if you could push it too far, and then it's going to potentially be viewed as an employment amount if it's depending on how it's presented. So we need to be incredibly careful how we do that, but there's no doubt that having had the same rate for the best part of 20 years, it probably should be higher. And I say that as somebody who receives rates for getting involved in things, as well as somebody who works through an organisation to pay people. So I do have a perspective from both sides.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that I think you're right, Jim. I think the very fact that those rates have not changed for a very long time suggests that they probably should be looked at again, and they're probably not high enough. But there are some wider considerations as well, and a balancing act. I mean, it's not just a reward and recognition payment. It's also a way of reducing or eliminating barriers to access that would otherwise arise because of people's financial circumstances. And that's a key consideration. But the very people who are likely to have barriers to access for financial reasons are also those who are likely to be in receipt of other payments too. So we have to be mindful of the complex interaction with tax and benefits. So it's not straightforward, I think, but that's not an excuse for never changing it. So I think, interestingly, of all the complaints that I'm aware of around payments, the overall level doesn't seem to be as big an issue as actually just having an efficient and humane way of delivering them. But it doesn't mean to say we shouldn't also address the issue of the actual rates. But that's my thoughts. Any other thoughts on that particular issue?
Alice Williams has her hand up, and I also see Savi's physically putting her hand up as well.
Hi, thanks, Sylvia. Yeah, I'd agree with what Jeremy's just said in terms of the complaints that come through. What we see by far and away the biggest complaints, and we've seen it in the chat as well, is the payments are not smoothly done. They're not made consistently. They're not made in a timely way, which all suggest internal problems, but that aren't just my organisation, because I'm seeing them the same comment across the board. So there's something about the flow between finance and how we make the payments. But just to pick up on Jeremy's previous point around barriers to access, again, one of the things that we have generally found is that where people are in receipt of various different benefits, whether they're public benefits or private benefits, it's usually those people who are at greatest risk by accepting a payment. When we first set up involvement payments, we thought that that would be an enabler for people with, for example, low income. And actually what we have found is in some cases the opposite. So people with low income who are who are dependent on benefits, the risk is so high in terms of them losing them that they are usually or often the people who say, I cannot accept this payment because it puts me in a precarious position. Expenses, yes, pay my train fare, bus fare, food, pay my childcare. And we have focused really rigorously on how we offer things like generous carer support and childcare, so that we can take that financial burden away from people. But yeah, it's been a really interesting thing over the last few years that what we thought would be an enabler actually has not turned out to be the case on the whole. It's not true across the board, of course.
Did we want to take Savi's point as well?
Yes. Well, briefly, I would say that it's helpful to organisations if funders and commissioners think about payment and building in adequate payments into the funding of research from the outset. It's much harder later on in the life of a research project or programme to readjust the rates considerably without losing contributor hours, so to speak. So it's about making that something that is thought about both by those applying for funding and by those providing funding from the outset, I think. But tying in with that point that was just made, maybe there's also something to be said for working collectively and using the strength of organisations like NIHR to get a more generous approach to public contributors from the benefits system, because that is something that's to some extent socially determined. And while individual organisations may have very little power in those circumstances, and individual contributors even less, maybe together we can get a shift.
Various comments have caught my eye in the chat. One from Richard Stevens saying, why do I have to go through so much bureaucracy to get something that you say you were offering me as my reward and recognition? I've sometimes spent longer trying to get the money for a meeting than I did at the meeting itself. I think that's a point very well made. It kind of brings a lot of this to life. I've also noted that Francesco has a couple of times asked the question about, should NIHR CED, that's our centre, be doing more to signpost to the Bedford CAB service? I don't know what more could we be doing, Sylvia, to address that issue?
I think the capacity is there. I think it's a really good question though about what more can we do, and I'd put that out to the chat as well. At the moment, obviously, we mention it in the guidance, so it's the contact details are included there. We've got some kind of regularly scheduled tweets coming from NIHR involvement, but definitely there's more we could be doing in terms of promotion. I think for myself, just a learning from this event might be to, whenever I speak about payments, to have it in the back of my mind to mention the fact that we do provide are a subscriber organisation to the Benefits Advice Service. But if there's any other thoughts about how we could better promote the service, I'm happy to take that on board, because it is a great service that could really help people understand whether they want to get involved or not. So definitely something we want to promote more.
I think one of the reasons why it's perhaps not been promoted as widely in the past is because it's only a small number of organisations are paying for the service, actually for other organisations, and it needs some more funding. But equally, as well as the kind of ongoing subscription payments, which about half a dozen organisations make to set the service up and keep it going, the service can be accessed on a sort of casework basis. So any funder who had a public contributor who was on benefits and was worried could basically pay for a consultation with that service as well. So it has the capacity to expand. And probably those of us, the organisations that are funding it at the moment, need to get together and get more organisations to come in and fund it, because I think it's going to grow in importance as time goes on. And I think the number of referrals and consultations are gradually going up.
I noticed a question earlier about what do we know what industry pays compared with what the public sector pays, and are there systematic differences that we should be perhaps taking note of? The difference between volunteering and wanting and expecting a payment, and not, if people have got different expectations, and you don't want to put off people who are happy to and want to volunteer by getting them embroiled in a payment system that they don't want to be part of. So I think there's something about recognising different people's expectations and getting the messaging right as well. I don't know if that's anything that anybody wants to comment on the panel.
I noticed a question around what individual organisations can be doing in terms of messaging with the work that we're doing in terms of the project. I think what I would ask is if you're aware of any, there's two things. If you're very interested in being part of the interest group, which is essentially the working group we're pulling together to co-produce this the practical guidance and so on, then do put your details, or reach out to Silvia, put her email address in the chat, and I'll do likewise. Reach out to us and let us know. Additionally, I think if you are aware of any particular groups that exist where this message could be shared that you think would be helpful for us to have on our list of stakeholder engagement groups, then please equally put those in the chat. That would be really helpful to us. And in terms of messaging, as we develop those messages collectively, then we can share through those networks to make sure the reach is as wide as possible.
A question that came right at the start was about, have we spoken to Universities UK or Research England about some of the structural issues? I don't think we have yet. I think whatever we do ought to be aligned with the conversations we're having with HMRC, because they're so interconnected. So I guess we need to get our ducks in a row and be clear what kind of conversation we want to have with the university bodies before we go and do that. But I still think we should. But I'm sorry to say we haven't yet done so. There was also a question, I think, earlier about what the timeline we think might be for the work that we're doing collectively with HMRC. I don't know if Jim or Reshma, if you want to offer a view on that.
Yeah, I think there was a question about specifically the categorization exercise, and that is in development as we speak. So Sylvia's been working on that anyway, and we hope to pull that together with the interest group over the summer, I think is our timeline. So again, we recognise the urgency of this work. In terms of approaching HMRC, I think that, as Jeremy said, it's about pulling together the key messages, the evidence, the case for change, and then taking that to them.
How long do you think that's going to take? Is that a whole year's activity or 6 months? What do we think?
We're trying to be ambitious, but I think we have to balance that with being realistic. So I know that Jim has had some very early kind of exploratory conversations with contacts in HMRC. Jim, do you want to say a little bit more about that?
as quickly as we possibly can has to be the answer, but it's very hard to put a time on it because, as with any large government department, it depends who you speak to and where they are in the hierarchy and what authority they have to act, essentially. So what we're trying to do is get contact with somebody with as high a level of decision making as is needed to change the guidance page, which I referred to earlier on the employment income manual. As soon as we found, as soon as we know who has the authority to change that manual, and that, as Reshma reflected, pages on that manual are changed weekly. So it doesn't require legislation, it just requires somebody with the appropriate authority to make that change. But it's a very big department and it's going to take a little while to find who they are and then brief them on it, get them alongside, give them the evidence for why it needs to change and get that change made. So I wish I could give you a timescale and say it'll be done in 2 months, but I can't do that at the moment. But we know it's urgent and we'll do it as quickly as we possibly can.
Mary.
Hi, yeah. Thanks everyone. We're coming near to the end of our time. I just wondered if there was a particular burning question that someone had before I hand over to Jeremy to do some summing up, and then I'll say something about our next event.
Lots of comments and contributions, offers of help and good examples of what people are doing, some challenging questions to NIHR and to CED, which is perfectly fair and reasonable, and thank you for those. So I think this has been well. I think we've proved the necessity for this event, and more work to go. And I think part of what you're saying in the reactions is please get on with the work that you're doing to engage with universities and with HMRC. Also, you're saying to us, don't forget DWP, because they're important too. Hopefully we've answered some of the questions. A lot of them stay unresolved. I'm not sure what we can do about that. I'm going to hand back, but thank you so much. Thank you for all of your contributions. Thank you to Silvia, to Reshma, and Jim, and to Savi, for your contributions too. I'm now going to hand back to Mary for the final bit.
Yeah, I think it's been great, and such good engagement with participants is really great, excellent. So that does give you a lot more work to put together. But there are some other issues that, for example, in terms of getting public contributors engaged at the early stages of research, we don't have payments for that. So that is another issue that maybe we could pick up at some later stage, apart from what's available from the CRN. So I would just like to thank everyone for their contribution. It's been really great. And I would like to remind colleagues that we will have another event webinar on the 15th of June, and that's going to focus on how do we create patient and public involvement and engagement that is genuinely inclusive? What does the evidence tell us? So registration for that event is live. So if you want to join us then, that would be great. So thank you all very much indeed.